I'm not sure I even knew what a vegan was actually before the time I became one. I became a vegetarian in 1978, I think it was, after I visited a slaughterhouse, and I stopped eating meat immediately. I ate fish for about another year or so until I read something about fish being sentient. I wasn't sure if fish could feel pain. And then in 1982, I guess it was the fall of 1982, I was clerking for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor on the United States Supreme Court. And Capitol Hill at that time was a rather economically depressed place. There were a lot of stray animals, many stray animals, and they would often get hit by cars. It was quite terrible. I remember once having an injured animal, and I called the Washington Humane Society, and they sent over the disease control officer, who was a woman named Ingrid Newkirk. And so she came to the court and she picked up the injured dog. And we got into a discussion about, she said to me that I should consider becoming a vegetarian. And I said, well, I was. And she asked me if that was for moral reasons. And I said, yes, indeed it was. And then she told me that she and her friend, Alex Pacheco, had just founded a group called People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And that Friday night, she and Alex came over and had dinner at our house. At some point in the evening, Ingrid went to the refrigerator, and she saw that I had milk in the refrigerator, and cheese, and ice cream in the freezer. And she proceeded to throw it all in the garbage. And I asked her why she was doing that. And she explained to me that if I took this seriously, I needed to think about being a vegan. I didn't even know what a vegan was. I was not even aware at that time that there were people who did not eat any animal products whatsoever. And so we had a discussion about it, and the next day she brought me a book called Fettered Kingdoms, written by a guy named John Bryant, who was British. And it was about animal exploitation as a general matter, and he basically described the use of animals and the various connections between meat and dairy and things like that. And it was about 70 or 80, it wasn't very long, it was about 70 or 80 pages. I read it, it was a Saturday, and I read the book. And I haven't eaten a dairy product since then. It became clear to me that veganism had to be the moral baseline of anything that was going to call itself an animal rights movement. And it became clear very quickly. What Peter was doing was bringing exposés, whether it was the Taub case, which involved experiments with deafferentation, where the nerves of primates were severed so that Taub could study certain things relating to stroke behaviors. That's where Pacheco got the job in the lab, and he worked in the lab, and he engaged in surveillance and brought that to the authorities, and Taub was prosecuted. That's what the animal rights movement was in its inception, was people bringing information sometimes gotten in questionable ways, or perhaps even gotten criminally, but that this information was being brought to the public in an attempt to start discussion about the legitimacy of animal use. We had all these exposés. Okay, once the exposés stopped, and campaigns and non-exposé campaigns were going to have to be developed, what were they going to look like? The question became, in what ways were they going to have a positive program that was different from what had come before? Because what had come before was largely things like the Humane Society of the United States and the Animal Welfare Institute, and those sorts of organizations, which were clearly focused on the regulation of animal exploitation. I think that it was then that you started getting this distinction, this debate between animal rights and animal welfare. The people who were the rights people were by and large vegans. They got it. They understood that if animals have real moral significance. If animals have rights, if they have a right not to be treated as our commodities, well, then that logically implies we can't eat them, we can't wear them. I mean, whatever else it implies, it implies you can't eat them, you can't wear them, you can't use them for various purposes. And so the rights people got that, by and large. The welfare people didn't. There was always that, that tension between the rights people and the welfare people. But then as the rights movement progressed, it started morphing more and more into a welfare movement. The animal welfare movement, from its emergence in the 19th century, was based on the notion that it was all right to use animals as long as we treated them properly. If you look at the distinction between use and treatment, the animal welfare position is use is okay if treatment is acceptable. The animal rights position is that use is not acceptable, however humane the treatment may be. The animal movement has now gone back explicitly to that position, that animal use is acceptable as long as treatment, yes, it's acceptable to use animals as long as we treat them properly. And that is the classic 19th century animal welfare position. The only difference between the movement now and the movement in the 19th century is that this movement, it claims to be more progressive in that it thinks that animals ought to have more protection than Jeremy Bentham thought in the 19th century, but it's really basically theoretically the same movement. In 1996, when I wrote Reign Without Thunder, I introduced this idea of new welfarism, that the difference between the old welfarists and the new welfarists was that the new welfarists believed that welfare regulation would and should get to the abolition of exploitation in the long term. There is no empirical reason to believe that the regulation of animal exploitation will ever lead to its abolition. There's no historical evidence for that. If anything, there is quite a bit of historical evidence that the more regulation we have, the more animal exploitation we have, because people end up feeling better about exploitation the more you regulate it, because they think it's okay, it's humane, it's acceptable, it's morally acceptable. Many of the practices that these welfarists attack are practices that are already economically vulnerable. For example, the gestation crate with pigs, with sows. Animal agriculture studies show that if you use an electronic sow feeding system as an alternative to these gestation crates, you increase sow productivity. You cut down on mortality. You cut down on disease. So a lot of these campaigns that are the target of animal welfare people, animal welfare groups like PETA, HSUS, etc., just about all of them, are practices that are economically vulnerable. Now, one might ask legitimately, well, wait a minute, if they're economically not viable, why doesn't industry shift without being told by the animal people to shift? Because if they're rational actors, wouldn't they do what was economically efficient? And the answer is, it's more complicated than that. When factory farming was developing, the people who were designing this, they weren't factoring in that we're not dealing with widgets, we're dealing with sentient beings that get stressed and get ill as a result of that stress. So people weren't really thinking about, they were thinking about concentration, concentrating commodities and increasing profits. They weren't thinking about, and they weren't factoring in what the costs were going to be of that intense concentration. And what's coming out now is, is indications that certain aspects of factory farming are very economically inefficient. But it takes time for that information to get out, for that information to become internalized within the industry, and for capital costs to be incurred to change those practices. Industries like the meat industry or biomedical research, for that matter, will resist any sort of regulation, even if they don't think it's particularly harmful, because they always need to impose opportunity costs on opponents or adversaries, because they want to make sure that everybody understands, if you come after us, if you want us to change something, we're going to exact our pound of flesh from you. I remember having a conversation with some vivisectors at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was then teaching, and I said, why are you guys opposing the 1985 amendments to the Animal Welfare Act. They're not going to hurt you. If anything, they're going to help you. And they said, yeah, we know it's going to, but we've got to oppose it, because if we don't oppose it, if we're not seen to oppose it, then you might come after us on something we really don't like. What's happened is that the animal movement has become, there's this bizarre partnership between animal industries and animal organizations, where animal organizations are going after these after industries for largely, minor changes. They go through this dance, they yell and scream at each other, and then there's some accommodation, which doesn't require that industry do very much. The animal people then declare victory and send around 80,000 million pieces of direct mail and ask, tell people, you can help change the world, just write us your check. And they make lots of money. I never thought when I wrote Rain Without Thunder that one day PETA would be having partnerships with large fast food chains and whatnot, and promoting humanely slaughtered this and nicely gassed that and things like that. I never thought that would happen. I was just looking at some of the emails I got today, and the consistent theme in so many of these things that I'm reading is various animal welfare reforms are being disregarded. I mean, whether it's there's now a move to start horse slaughter again. I have all these activists in Britain who advocated against the use of dogs in fox hunting and stuff. The ban's being disregarded. I mean, it's like all of these welfare things, none of them ever really works, because we haven't changed the way people think. And as long as we don't change the way people think, it's never, you're never going to see any sustained change. But that paradigm shift has got to center on and focus on what people eat. As long as 99% of us think it's all right to eat animal products, with the best justification we have for inflicting pain, suffering, and death on 56 billion animals every year, not including aquatic animals, is that they taste good. Well, as long as you've got most of us thinking that, nothing's ever going to change. I was saying in the 1980s, what we ought to be doing is coming up with creative, nonviolent ways of educating people about veganism so that we can shift the paradigm away from the property status of animals, because that was also clear to me as a lawyer, as a law professor. It was clear to me that animals are economic commodities as long as we have this relationship of property to property owners. As long as animals were economic commodities, every time you try to protect animal interests, you were paying money. What that's going to do is it's going to severely limit the sort of protection that we accord animals. And that's why animal welfare doesn't work, because it basically, we can't afford to protect animal interests, particularly in the world that we live in now, with the fact that we have all of these trade barriers down, we have this, quote, free trade situation. It's never going to work. If we really want to change the world, we've got to focus on veganism. And so I was saying this fairly early on, and I was encountering resistance. I encountered resistance fairly early on. Part of it was many of the people involved in these organizations, particularly the groups like HSUS and Animal Welfare Institute and Fund, these were organizations where many of the people involved with them weren't vegan. And also, they went to a donor base for contributions of people who weren't vegans, and they didn't want to upset them. They didn't want to alienate them. So people wanted safe campaigns. They didn't really ask anybody to do anything other than give money to support the campaign. They didn't require that they change, they didn't require any sorts of personal changes. And so I encountered that right away, and it became clear to me that the economics of these organizations was inconsistent with what I thought ought to be the case, which was basically promoting veganism. The predicate for veganism is already set. Most of us already accept all of the moral views that are the predicate for becoming a vegan. We all believe it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals. All right? So now the next question becomes, what do we mean by necessity? Well, whatever it means, whatever abstract meaning it has, if it has any meaning whatsoever, its minimal meaning has to be that it's wrong to inflict suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Because if it's all right to inflict suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience, then you've got a loophole that's now so large you could drive a truck through it. So if the moral notion that we all accept, if that has any meaning, then it's got to be the case that we can inflict suffering and death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Okay. Problem is, 99.9999999% of our animal use can only be justified by reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. It's got to go. If we are at all, if we mean what we say, we have no choice. Veganism is the only rational, logical response to accepting that it is morally wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals. When you explain it to people this way, people say, well, gee, I understand that. I'm not sure, I don't know. I don't know, I don't know that I'm going to become a vegan or not yet. But you've got me thinking. I now don't think it's crazy. I used to think it was crazy. I don't think it's crazy. I now understand what you're saying. I need to think about it. And that's my views. As long as I got you there, as long as I got you to that point, then I've got you thinking. I am often asked, what do you do if somebody says, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not ready to go vegan right away. Should I eat cage-free or, I said, no. You can go vegan right away. It's not difficult. Trust me, it's not difficult. It's easy. Well, but I'm not sure. Okay, look, I don't think you should eat, we've had this conversation. You've acknowledged that you think that eating animals and animal products is not morally justifiable. Okay, well, then, that's your conscience. If you're going to continue to eat them, that's a decision you're making in the face of your assessment that it's not morally justifiable. However, let me say this to you. If you feel you can't do it right away, and I would disagree with you, you can. If you feel you can't, then go vegan in stages. Go vegan for breakfast for 3 weeks. You'll see that you're not going to die. Your arms and legs don't fall off. You don't go blind. And then you go vegan for lunch for a couple weeks. And then you go vegan for dinner, and boom, there you are, you're vegan. To me, being a vegan is the most important form of activism if you are committed to the abolitionist, nonviolent ideal. It is the most important aspect of your behavior. So be a vegan. Educate others, whether it's in your vet office, whether it's in a airport lounge where you're waiting for a flight, or whether you're on the airplane and talking to somebody about why you have a special meal. Talk and educate everybody you can. Get the literature that is available on the website from the increasing number of vegan abolitionist organizations. Get their literature, pass it out. Go to schools, talk to schools, talk to high schools. Rather than spending several hours tabling at your local community college about why kids should be eating cage-free eggs, try to explain to those kids why they should be eating eggs at all or any other animal products. Are you going to convince them all? No. But you know what? You'll convince some. You'll convince some, and then they'll convince some, and then they'll convince some. And it will grow. It's a zero-sum game. Every dollar we spend, every minute, every dollar of resource, every minute of labor that we spend focused on welfare regulation is a dollar less and a minute less of labor than we're spending on promoting veganism and abolition. Well, but what about the people who are never going to become vegan? You know what? Let's worry about those people once we've gotten everybody who will become a vegan. Once we've convinced the people who are out there who can be convinced. Once we do that, we haven't even started with that yet. Once we do that, then we'll worry about the people who aren't going to change. I am optimistic. I do see things changing. I see an emerging group of folks who are committed, who are coming to recognize that this is a fundamental moral issue. It requires that we embrace the principle of nonviolence. They understand that embracing the principle of nonviolence means embracing veganism, not as a lifestyle, like whether you ski or whether you don't ski, but as it's your fundamental commitment to nonviolence and to the abolition of animal exploitation. And I see people moving in that direction. And I am optimistic.